New Testament readers, we are in week 30, and this week we complete the book of Acts. Now, that's really a remarkable thing. This means that we will be completing all of the big narrative books of the early part of the New Testament, the four Gospels plus the book of Acts. So we're deep into the book, and 30 weeks is more than halfway through, and the book of Acts is more than halfway through the New Testament if you look at how many pages you've got there. Making a lot of progress here. Now, as we've said, in the last quarter of the book of Acts, Paul is in Roman custody. He's being held awaiting trial for his life. Now, we see in these chapters the dilemma that these Roman officials have. Paul is being held without any clear charges. Paul has kind of weaseled his way, as it were, by God's guidance into protective custody with the Romans, and they have a legal system that is the basis of our own when we follow it, and that is you're not supposed to be held without charges. And so they're looking for, what are we charging this man with? Well, Paul has essentially opted for this, and God has assured him that he is taking him to Rome by this means for testimony. So Paul has this privilege because he is an elite Roman citizen. Citizenship is an elite status in the Roman Empire. And that means that he has the opportunity to appeal his case to the emperor, which he does. So this keeps him safe from those who are trying to assassinate him. But it also is the means by which he speaks before kings and rulers, just as God had said about Paul to Ananias back in chapter 9, when Ananias was about to baptize Paul and was reluctant about that. Now, in this section, we're going to see Paul recount Jesus' appearance to him on the road to Damascus, just as he did earlier in his speech that he gave in the temple. This is a very, very important narrative in the book of Acts. It's told 3 times, and it's important for a couple of means. First of all, it shows us Jesus is truly alive in his body, because Paul distinguishes this from a visionary experience. This is a physical experience. A glorified man, but a physical man stands before him in this situation. It shows us Jesus' lordship continuing, and it helps us understand why Paul has been transformed, and that Paul understands his authority as God's spokesperson comes from this appearance of Jesus. He's been commissioned in this way. I want you to notice how often Paul affirms his Jewish identity in this section. Paul never says, "I am a Christian." Christian isn't a word that Christians use at this point. It's probably used by outsiders for them, and we'll see that in chapter 26. But Paul will say many times, "I am a Jew." And the reason he's saying that is he's saying, in order for me to be faithful to my Jewish heritage, I had to be faithful to what God was revealing, and that is that Jesus is his true king. That Jesus is, as we would put it later, God incarnate. Now, notice the resistance that powerful people have to Paul's message. We see Festus, the Roman governor, who is corrupt. Felix is the one who's corrupt. Festus, the later governor, is just confused. We see Agrippa, who is one of these Herodian kings. He is the great-grandson of Herod the Great. Terrible guy. We won't get into his story. Paul speaks to all of these people respectfully, and he appeals to them with the gospel, with the story of Jesus, and with the story of his own conversion. And they're standoffish about that. Why? Well, they have a lot to lose, they think, because they have power. And this fits a pattern that we see throughout the biblical narrative. Holding power, our own power, is what makes us resist the call of God. Now, it's very interesting. We have a long chapter 27 in this section where Paul is shipwrecked. This is actually the longest ancient literature that we have about a sea voyage and a shipwreck. If you leave out, imaginative stories like the Odyssey, which isn't much about the sailing. It's more about what happens along the way. But why this extended narrative? Well, at the beginning of this story, Paul is the lowest man on the ship. He's a prisoner. By the time we come to the end of the story, Paul is in command. Everyone is deferring to what he does. And so we see how God's authority is being exercised through his people in their situations of lowliness. So we come to chapter 28, finally, after this epic journey, and the narrator will say in verse 14, "And so we came to Rome." And we remember back to chapter 23, when the Lord said, "As you have been my witness in Jerusalem, so you will be in Rome." now that's fulfilled. So the book is going to end with Paul as a prisoner, which looks bad. It's going to end with him speaking to a group of Jewish leaders who will be deeply divided by the gospel. And this is something else that's happened through the whole book of Acts. The gospel always divides people. This is its nature. Yet, in that situation, audience divided, Paul a prisoner, the narrator, Luke, is going to say that Paul continued for 2 full years boldly and without hindrance. Now, what happened to Paul at the end of those 2 years? Acts doesn't tell us. We'll talk about that again at a later point in the New Testament read-along. Happy reading this week.